The desert sun was setting behind the mesas when Thomas Red Cloud first saw her lying there in the dust, and she looked more like a ghost than a living woman wrapped in that old burlap cloth that had seen better days. And he dismounted slowly from his horse, because you don't rush toward suffering, you approach it with respect. She didn't move when his shadow fell across her face, and for a moment he thought maybe she had already passed. But then her eyes opened just a crack, and they were the palest blue he had ever seen, like water over stones in the creek back home. And she looked at him with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't quite trust either. Thomas knelt down beside her in that red dust that gets into everything out here in this country, and he said quietly, so as not to startle her, that he meant no harm, and would she let him help her? And she just kept looking at him with those pale eyes, like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just another desert vision. Could see she had been hurt badly, because there were marks on her arms and her face was swollen on one side, and her lips were cracked from the sun and no water. And he thought about his own daughter Sarah, who was about this woman's age, and what he would hope someone would do if Sarah was lying hurt somewhere far from home. The woman tried to speak, but her voice came out like dried leaves scraping together. So Thomas went to his horse and got his canteen, and he lifted her head gently, the way you would with a child, and let her drink just a little, because too much water too fast can make a person sick. And his mother had taught him that when he was just a boy learning the old ways. After she drank, she looked at him again, and this time there was something different in her eyes, like maybe she was seeing him as a person and not just as what other people had told her Apache men were supposed to be. And he had seen that look before that moment, when fear gives way to something else. He asked her name, and she whispered that it was Elizabeth, and he told her his name was Thomas and that he was going to take her somewhere safe. And she nodded just barely. And he wrapped her more securely in the burlap and lifted her as carefully as he could. And she weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. Thomas put her on his horse and climbed up behind her to keep her steady. And they rode slowly toward his small ranch that sat in a valley between two red hills, where he had lived alone since his wife Mary had died 3 winters ago, and where he kept a few cattle and grew vegetables in a garden that Mary had started and that he tended now in her memory. The ride took most of an hour, and Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness. And once she murmured something about Jacob, and Thomas didn't know who Jacob was, but he figured he would find out soon enough, because stories have a way of coming out when people are ready to tell them. When they reached his house, Thomas carried Elizabeth inside to the small bedroom that had belonged to his daughter before she married and moved to Santa Fe. And he laid Elizabeth on the bed and covered her with one of Mary's old quilts that still smelled faintly of the lavender she used to keep in the chest. Heated water on the stove and brought it in with clean cloths, and he washed the dirt and blood from Elizabeth's face and arms as gently as his rough hands could manage. And he thought about how Mary used to say that kindness was the only thing that really mattered in this life, and everything else was just noise. Elizabeth slept for almost 2 days, and Thomas checked on her regularly and gave her water and broth when she would wake for a few minutes, and once she grabbed his hand and said thank you. And he just nodded, because sometimes words aren't necessary between people who understand suffering. On the 3rd morning, Elizabeth was sitting up when he brought her breakfast, and her color was better, and the swelling had gone down. And she looked at him with clear eyes and said she supposed she owed him an explanation. And Thomas said she didn't owe him anything, but if she wanted to talk, he would listen. She told him then about Jacob, her husband, who had started out as a good man, or so she thought, but who had changed after they lost their farm in Missouri, and how they had come west looking for a fresh start. But Jacob had only found whiskey and anger instead, and how the anger had found its way to his fists more and more often. Thomas listened without interrupting, because his mother had also taught him that listening was a gift you gave to people, and that sometimes it was the only gift they needed. And Elizabeth talked for a long time. And sometimes she cried, and Thomas just sat there in the chair by the bed and let her words fill the room. She told him that 3 days ago, Jacob had beaten her worse than ever before, and then he had wrapped her in that burlap cloth and thrown her in the back of their wagon and driven out into the desert, and he had dug a shallow grave, and he had said she was dead to him now, and he was going to bury her and be done with it. But then something had happened that Jacob hadn't expected, because A group of riders had appeared on the ridge, and he had gotten spooked, and he had left Elizabeth there by that open grave and ridden off. And she had lain there for hours, not knowing if she should feel grateful or cursed to still be breathing. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest when she said that, because he had seen cruelty before in his 62 years, but there was something particularly dark about a man who would do that to his own wife. And he thought about what he would say if he ever met this Jacob, though he hoped that meeting would never come. Elizabeth looked at him then with an expression he couldn't quite read, and she said she knew what people thought about Apache men, and she had been taught her whole life to fear them and to think of them as savages, but here she was alive because of one, while her own white husband had tried to bury her in the desert. And what did that say about the things people teach? Thomas smiled a little at that because he had lived his whole life with what people thought about who he was, and he had learned long ago that the only opinion that mattered was the one you had of yourself when you looked in the mirror and whether you could live with what you saw there. He told Elizabeth she could stay as long as she needed and that he would ask no payment and expect nothing in return. And she said she had nowhere else to go anyway, and no money, and nothing but the clothes on her back, which weren't even really clothes, just that, burlap cloth. And Thomas said that Mary's clothes were still in the chest and Elizabeth was welcome to them. So Elizabeth stayed, and at first she mostly rested and healed, and Thomas went about his work tending the cattle and the garden and fixing the fence that was always falling down in one spot or another, because that's what fences do. And one evening Elizabeth came out to where he was working and asked if she could help. Thomas was surprised because he hadn't expected it, but he said sure, if she felt up to it, and he gave her some of the easier tasks, and they worked together in the evening light and didn't talk much. But there was a companionable quality to the silence, and it reminded Thomas of working alongside Mary in the old days. The days turned into weeks, and Elizabeth grew stronger, and she started doing more around the house, and she was a good cook, which Thomas appreciated because his own cooking was barely adequate, and she made bread that reminded him of his mother's bread, and she hummed sometimes while she worked, and the sound made the house feel less empty. One afternoon they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, and Elizabeth said she had been thinking and she wanted to know why Thomas had helped her that day, and he considered the question for a long moment before answering because it deserved a real answer, not just a quick one. He told her about his daughter Sarah and how she had married a man named William, who Thomas hadn't been sure about at first because William was white and Thomas knew how the world worked and how hard it would be for them. But Sarah had loved him, and William had turned out to be a good man who loved Sarah right back and who didn't care what anyone thought. And Thomas said that when he saw Elizabeth lying there in the dust, he had thought about Sarah and about how he would want someone to help her if she ever needed it. And he said that was really all there was to it, because kindness doesn't need a complicated reason, it just needs someone willing to act. Elizabeth was quiet for a while, and then she said she had spent her whole life being told that there were good people and bad people, and that you could tell which was which by looking at them and by where they came from and what they believed, but that didn't make sense anymore if it ever had. And Thomas said that was a wise thing to realize, even if it had come through hard experience. They fell into a rhythm then over the following weeks, and it felt natural, like they had been living this way for years instead of just months. And Thomas taught Elizabeth about the cattle, and she taught him a recipe for apple pie that her grandmother had taught her, and they shared stories in the evenings about their lives before Elizabeth told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, and about her mother who had died when Elizabeth was young, and about how she had met Jacob at a church social, and how he had seemed so confident and strong, and how she had mistaken his stubbornness for strength until it was too late. Thomas told her about Mary and how they had met when they were both just 16, and how her father hadn't wanted her to marry an Apache man, but she had married him anyway, and how they had built this ranch together from nothing, and how she had died from pneumonia one winter when the snow had been too deep to get to town for the doctor. They talked about their